Hello everyone, this is Bob Lowe, CSIA Executive Director. Thank you for attending the August CSIA webinar. Today's webinar will educate you on proper planning for an industrial automation project. Be sure to ask questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, and questions will be answered during the webinar, so be sure to ask them. The webinar will be archived for later viewing and the slides will be available also. The host and sponsor of our monthly webinars is Software Toolbox, a CSIA partner member. Software Toolbox helps system integrators lower their risk on projects that involve software by providing them a unique mix of off-the-shelf software products and rapid response technical support that minimizes the need for custom code and lowers field startup time risk. I would like to introduce today's webinar presenter, Dan Roessler. Dan is the author of Control System Migrations, a practical project management handbook by Momentum Press, and his career spanning over 20 years began as a process control engineer and project manager for a major chemical company. His background also includes roles as a project and proposal manager for a system integrator and business development and marketing manager positions with major automation vendors. Daniel is currently the owner of DANR Consulting, which provides content marketing, business optimization, and project management services to engineering, software, and manufacturing companies. So, without further delay, here's Dan.
Thank you, Bob. Monica, have you given me presenter rights?
Yes, I have. Click on the tab, your presentation tab on the top if this doesn't work.
Yep, I'm on it. I'm not able to scroll forward. Ah, there it goes. Got it. Okay. So just a quick note that my publisher, Momentum Press, is offering a 15% discount through the end of September for CSIA members that purchase a hard copy of my book from their website. And you can just enter the discount code ROE92014. I'll show this again at the end of the presentation for any of you that might be interested. So today we're talking about how to leverage FELs to benefit your organization and facilitate project management success. We'll start with a general discussion of FELs, including their benefit to the end user clients, as well as to system integrators such as yourselves. We will also examine some key focus areas to consider during FELs with examples, including organization, granularity, risk analysis, and project management requirements definitions. Finally, we will look at how to convert scope, schedule, and budget from FEL documents into useful project management tools. So in simple terms, front-end loading studies, or FELs, can be defined as the exercise of moving effort forward to the planning and early design phases of a project to identify risk up front when you have a greater ability to reduce or eliminate them. This allows feasibility analysis to be done prior to large spending outlays. And most FELs use a gated process, and there's many variations and approaches. For example, some clients may choose to do a plus or minus 50% FEL and then jump down to a plus or minus 10%, while others may use a more traditional four-phased FEL approach. So we're not going to get into a lot of the specifics about the differences in these phases, but be aware that it's all over the place depending on the client, the industry, and you know, some other parameters. So how do clients benefit from FELs? Well, first of all, FELs enable risks to be identified early and mitigation steps to be taken through design, engineering, and planning activities to minimize their impact. This, in turn, avoids costly issues later in the project and frequently reduces the overall project cost. FELs also provide better scope definition early in a project, resulting in more realistic schedules and budgets. The origins of FELs were more in the physical project world with large construction projects because changes in the construction phase were so costly. However, they have also become commonplace in automation projects these days when you have any automation project of a significant size, and that's a really good thing for both the client and for system integrators. Before automation FELs were commonplace, many times clients felt cheated when they got into projects because costs started increasing and schedules dragged out, and they had a lot of frustration, and it was projected onto the engineering service providers, so there was a negative perception there. And it was really unfair because the reason that a lot of those issues came up was because there wasn't a good definition at the beginning of the project. So FELs have kind of helped to educate clients and end users on the fact that the upfront planning really is a critical part of alleviating some of the headaches that occur later in projects. So what are the scenarios for FEL execution? Well, the optimum one is that a client hires your company to perform the FEL, and then the follow-on work is sole sourced to you. But in many cases, as we all know these days, there's procedures and processes in the purchasing organizations that sometimes require them to be bid out. The second option is that clients put together an FEL themselves and then hire you, or typically in a competitive bid situation, to do the project. This happens with much less frequency because of the limited engineering resources that most manufacturing organizations have today. And then the final scenario is that a control system vendor, an EPC, or another system integrator performs the FEL, and then the project execution is a competitive bid. We're going to assume the first scenario for the majority of this presentation, but toward the end of it, I'll talk a little bit about the latter two scenarios and how you can still leverage some of the FEL documents to help your organization as you put together your proposal and then move into the follow-on work phase. So how do FELs benefit system integrators? Well, first of all, they present a great opportunity to build a successful project management foundation going into a project. When properly thought out and planned, FEL deliverables can benefit your organization by reducing project management setup time. If you've done your FEL in the right way, you already have the base documents that you'll need for your project management monitoring and reporting activities, and this will streamline those tasks. FELs can also help to identify and reduce the impact of high-risk areas to you. This is particularly important on firm price and fixed bid jobs. So identifying those high-risk areas is valuable to your client from an overall project cost standpoint, but it's also valuable to you as an integrator to know where your risks are and work to eliminate their impact to you from a financial standpoint, a schedule impact, and so forth. Finally, FELs tend to decrease change orders substantially, and I've actually had integrators ask me in the past, why do I want to decrease change orders? That decreases my revenue in some cases. And the point is that you really build credibility with your client when you don't have change orders. And the shift isn't that you don't do the work; it's that you tend to do the work earlier in the process. So keep in mind that that's a real benefit to you as well. So let's look at the 4 common automation FEL deliverables. Note that there are a large list of other deliverables on FELs, including drawings, logic narratives, graphic standards, etc. All of these things vary depending on the client, based on the FEL phase you're executing, and a number of other project specifics. But we're going to focus on these 4 core deliverables. And they are scope of work, schedule, estimate, and risk assessment. And consider the combination of these, the building blocks for the FEL, but also the building blocks for your project management. And you've probably seen them before in the project management triangle, which is often used to represent the fundamental elements and relationships that form the foundation of a project. Scope, schedule, and budget are the 3 primary elements, which are also the three of the 4 core FEL deliverables. So you may have seen this represented in a number of ways, as there are many versions of this project management triangle floating around, but I like this one because it also ties quality in as a critical part of all of the the three major elements. It's important that your client understands that the relationships between these primary elements is fixed. In other words, you can't reduce the budget without either reducing the scope or extending the schedule. You can't expand the scope without impacting the schedule and budget, etc. So each of these elements is tied together in a fixed way, and changes to one necessitate changes to at least one of the others. Many clients don't recognize this as a fundamental truth, which is why they are resistant to change orders and frustrated when they get them. They think, oh, well, you know, I'm just going to add a little scope item. Why should that impact budget or schedule? I know that you've probably all dealt with that. So, you know, presenting this project management triangle and educating them a little bit on the scope, schedule, budget relationships is a good way of having that conversation with them and helping to make sure they understand that there's a legitimate driver behind deviations in cost and schedule as a result of scope changes and so forth. So from an FEL standpoint, it's really critical that you create consistency between your scope, schedule, and budget. It will provide you with the foundation and the fixed relationships that you'll need to actually execute the project and to do the project management activities in the follow-on project. This will simplify your tracking and reporting. For example, if you're building a house and you have a single schedule line item that says complete the foundation, and the duration's 2 months. But then when you start looking at your budget, you build a lot more granularity into it, and you've got a line item for excavation, you've got one for leveling, for purchasing concrete and rebar, for pouring concrete, etc. Then what you've done is you've created an inconsistency between the schedule and the budget. And so as you're spending money doing the items in your budget, you have no way of tracking that against your schedule because you have a single line item. And I know this is a very generic, general example, and we'll look at some more automation-specific examples in a moment. But the point is that inconsistency can really create havoc with project management activities and the follow-on project as you start executing. So when we're talking about the 4 core FEL deliverables, we want to look at some key areas and consider them in how we approach the FEL documentation. The first is, how do you organize your document? And the second is the granularity or level of detail that you use. There needs to be consistency between the documents, just as we just discussed, and we'll look at some automation examples as I mentioned. The second item we want to talk about is risk analysis. It's another core deliverable of it, and it should be part of every FEL. Many clients don't call this out as a document when they hire system integrators to do an FEL, but it's always worth including. I've always included risk analysis documents. You know, there's a lot of various approaches to how you want to do that, and my perspective is a standalone document that calls out the risk in paragraph form, explains what the consequences are, and then talks about how to mitigate them or gives the client options for mitigating them is a great approach. And I guarantee you your clients will appreciate this. And then finally, we're going to talk about one of my pet peeves, which is far too often FELs do not cover project management requirements. If you're developing a scope of work document, part of the scope of work needs to be to define what will be expected as part of the project management activities. So you want to define and clarify project management requirements in the FEL. So let's look at examples of each of these and talk a little bit about them. So when you set up an estimate, a scope document, or a schedule as part of an FEL, there are many options for how you can organize it. And it's important to give thought to this and to set them up in a way that matches how you're going to manage the project. This will allow you to actually transition from the FEL phase to the project execution phase fairly seamlessly. The first option is to organize by physical layout. So specifically in this example, we've got an estimate that's constructed where there's work being done in the catalyst area, there's work being done in the distillation area, and there's a list of responsibilities under each of those, and it's really regardless of discipline. So you'll have engineering tasks together with procurement tasks together with construction tasks. All of the work associated with that physical area is in one place. Now, this approach can be beneficial when a project's being executed in phases by physical location or over a long calendar period, when the work teams are in different physical areas are different. So, for example, you have a team that's focused on just the catalyst area and another focused on the distillation area. This approach can make sense. The downside of it is that it's difficult to pull out the discipline-specific work scopes. So, for example, if you've got a subcontractor that's doing the construction piece and you want to pull out the construction pieces, it's not easy to do if you set things up this way. So you want to give some thought to that. And the second downside is that most integrators don't tend to set up their work breakdown structure in their financial systems this way, which means that budget tracking can be really complex if you want to use this approach. A second common option is to organize documents by EPC category. So you would have an engineering header with all the engineering activities, procurement headers with procurement activities, and construction header with construction activities. This approach can be beneficial when the end user is doing the procurement and a construction contractor is doing the construction, and you're being hired to do the engineering piece. So that way everyone can pull out their pieces of work very, very easily, regardless of whether you're talking about the scope of work document, the schedule, or the budget. And this also allows for easier resource planning by the project manager in some of those types of scenarios. But there are some challenges too. First, it's not readily evident what the linking and dependencies between the different tasks are. So that can sometimes be a challenge. And secondly, the change orders that might occur later in the project where they're distributed across different functions can be really challenging to integrate into the existing schedules and budgets. So that's something to keep in mind if you use this approach. And finally, a third approach is to organize your FEL documents by functional disciplines so that each discipline has a header and then subcategories. The level of work breakdown structure headers can vary greatly depending on the project. So you may have just a category of control system engineering on one project because it's fairly small and that's all you need. And on another, you've got a large project and it may require further breakdown to I/O configuration, logic configuration, graphics configuration, etc. So this is a common way for many integrators to handle budgets within their financial systems. So it tends to be a pretty popular approach to how you set up your scope, your schedule, and your budget in the FEL phase. The downside is that if you have multiple organizations involved, for example, you've got an end user that's doing pieces of the work and a control system vendor doing other pieces, it can sometimes be difficult to extract their individual components of work activities out. And note that the point here isn't that any one of these approaches is the right approach. Really what I'm trying to communicate is that you should be giving thought to how you organize the FEL documents for your client so that what you're creating in the FEL is aligned with how you want to manage the project. And you can actually take the scope of work document and use it as your guide through the project. You can take the estimate and use it as your budget during the project. And you can take the schedule and use it as your schedule when you're actually doing the project. So coupled with the way you organize FEL documents, another key factor is the granularity you use. How much detail is enough? Can there be too much? And the answer to that really is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all blanket approach for every project. There are many factors that go into the decision about what is the right granular breakdown of the work breakdown structure. And this is largely dependent on the FEL phase you're in, but it's also dependent on a number of other factors. So we're going to look at a couple of examples to kind of explain this. So assume you're developing a budget for your automation project and it requires that you configure logic in the control system. which is a typical part of your responsibilities. So there are three types of logic. There's sequential logic, there's safety interlocks, and there's advanced control algorithms with associated quantities as listed in the table. You've budgeted a certain number of hours per each. So for example, you're planning 2 hours to configure each sequence, and since there are a total of 5 sequences, this would mean that there's 10 hours budgeted for the configuration of all the sequences. So you need to set up your work breakdown structure and schedule so that you can accurately and easily track progress on your project coming out of the FEL. And you consider this logic a bit of a high-risk area because there's always some uncertainty in more complex logic configurations. So what are your options? Well, there's really 3. As you create your FEL documents, the first option is to have one line item that lumps together all of the logic configurations. It's a single line item that says logic configuration equals 54 hours. And this approach might work if you have a really large project and that 54 hours at about $100 an hour is a minimal impact to the project, and if you overspend it a little bit, you can absorb the cost. This approach might also work if you're really confident that the estimated hours are correct. So you've worked on this control system with this client before, you know exactly what you're getting into, and you don't have any concerns about the logic taking more time than what you've budgeted. But the downside to this approach is that you have no ability to measure whether you're making the expected progress and to make any adjustments if you aren't. So, for example, if you start seeing that the safety interlocks are taking an hour longer each than what you budgeted, you have no insight into that. So a second option is to have a line item in your budget and schedule for each logic type, which is what you saw on the previous slide. That was how I set it up in that particular budget. There's a line item for sequencing, one for safety interlocks, and one for advanced control algorithms. This enables you to see, for instance, that you're behind schedule on the sequencing and provides the potential to make adjustments to staffing or shift dollars and time and resources between the different budget items. So if you are trending over on safety interlocks, maybe you can save some time on advanced control algorithms. So you've got some flexibility there. And the other benefit of that approach is that if you've got different team members working on different logic types, for example, let's say that you've got one team that's doing all your safety interlocks and another team that's doing all your advanced control algorithms, then this strategy provides a natural separation of those work activities. The final option is to list every individual logic element to be configured. So in the example, there were 5 logic sequences planned, so we would actually have 5 line items, one for each of those individual sequences. And this provides really high resolution into the work being done, but it's usually overkill, and it makes budget reporting and tracking very cumbersome. I mean, think about your engineering team having to track their time at that level of granularity. I mean, they would spend more time tracking their hours and trying to charge to the right code than they would actually doing the work. So you know, about the only time that you would want to use that maximum level of detail is when you have an extremely high risk area and you know that you've got some concerns there, and you really want to just focus in on it. And so I would just suggest that you want to tend to shy away from too much detail because it can be as dangerous as not enough detail. You know, just as an example, if you're looking at converting 200 old Provox FSTs to Delta V, you know, and you know that the old Provox FSTs aren't documented very well, the logic narratives aren't correct, that type of thing, then you might want to really hone in on those specific activities and make sure that you're tracking them at a pretty granular level. So as you can see, thinking about the detail of work breakdown structure is important. And doing this in the FEL phase allows you to tailor the FEL deliverables in a way that will allow you to use those and leverage those as you move forward in the project. So let's look at another granularity example. Schedule is the second foundational element of project management. And it's not simply when you're going to complete the project, it's when you're going to complete tasks and subtasks, and in what order and with what resources. So vital to a good schedule is an appropriate and consistent level of detail, and we really want to emphasize the consistency with the scope and budget. Good schedules balance calendar timing and project staffing, and another essential component of good schedules is having well-defined predecessor and successor relationships. So we're not going to talk a lot about some of those items, but as you set your task resourcing within your schedule, you want to give some thought to how you as an organization would work the project moving forward into the execution phase. So, for example, you can have a general discipline term such as controls engineering, or a very specific named resource such as Jane Smith. Now, obviously, in an FEL for a client, you're not going to put Jane Smith's name if the follow-on project is going to be bid out. But you can use a generic term such as Controls Engineer A to designate Jane Smith, so that when the RFP comes out and you're actually having to put together a bid, all you have to do is plug Jane Smith's name into your org chart, and you've got consistency with your schedule and so forth. So as you transition in the project, being able to plug in your staff and use the schedule that you've already created in the FEL will save you some time. And obviously many times, and depending on the FEL phase, you're not going to go into this level of detail in the schedule. But my contention is that if you've got the opportunity to create this level of detail in the schedule, do it as early in the process as you can. In other words, if a client's okay with you going ahead and getting into that granular detail within the schedule at an early phase of the FEL, I would suggest that doing that benefits them as well as you. So consider that as an option. Now, obviously, if they say we're not going to pay for that level of detail at this point, then you might not be able to provide it. But you can always roll these tasks up into summary tasks in what you present to the client. So keep that in mind. Okay, so let's move on to risk. So here's a quick look at some of the most common high-risk areas of automation projects. We're not going to go over each one of these, but let's start by talking about graphics, because it will be a natural example that shows I guess, how you go about assessing the risk and considering how to mitigate them. So graphics are one of the most common issues because they're the interface point that allows users to interact with the control system and subsequently the actual plant process. And as most of you probably have encountered, everybody has a different opinion about how graphics should look. So if you talk to one operator on shift A and get input on graphics design, and then you talk to another operator on shift C 2 days later, you might get totally different perceptions of what graphics should look like. And then if you talk to the engineer, you might get a third. So this can create a lot of challenges. And so how do you go about mitigating the risk associated with graphics during an FEL? Well, one of the things is to try to build a graphics design guide into the FEL process if your client doesn't already have one. So if you're gathering input from invested parties, build that into a graphics design guide that your client buys off on early in the process. You also want to engage operations in graphics in as many ways as you can from the early stages of the FEL. And then a couple of other key points that you can consider in mitigating risk associated with graphics is defining the number of review cycles. For example, if a client wants 1 or 2 or 3 review cycles, define that and make sure that it's clear what those review cycles are for and how they're going to be done, because one of the things that I think is always a frustration to system integrators is that you have a design guide, you build the graphics per the design guide, and then the client starts looking at them and says, well, I'd like to change this, and could we add this, and maybe I want to use the different colors here, and all of those things add to your workload and to the work scope of the project and drive up the cost and prolong the schedule. So Defining the number of review cycles is important, and then defining who's responsible for approval and sign-off. For example, you know, is it going to be the engineer? Is it going to be the operations manager? Is it going to be the board operators themselves? So building all of that detail into your FEL can really help you and benefit you down the line when you're actually moving into the project, because it reduces some of the risk associated with graphics. So there's a number of other items listed here that are common risk areas for automation projects as well. We won't review them all, but you'll notice that some of them are intangible things, such as poor teamwork or staffing changes. And these can be really difficult to address during the FEL phase, but planning can help. For example, you might not be able to foresee that your primary controls engineer is going to get pneumonia and be out for 2 months during the execution of the project. But when you create your staffing plan or start to put together staffing plans during the FEL, you can look at how to manage the team so that more than one individual is involved in the work. And by doing that, you have someone else that's familiar with the project, and you're not relying on a single person. Now, obviously, there are resource limitations in every organization, so some of the time, these kinds of scenarios just aren't realistic. But thinking about these types of things during the FEL phase can really benefit you. And just one more point on this slide, and that is that cutovers are probably one of the highest risk areas for any kind of automation project, you know, when you're actually cutting over live, especially if you're doing it hot. And so really doing detailed planning around that early in the process, it can be extremely valuable because, you know, I did a project a few years back that, you know, we spent tremendous amount of time doing cutover detailed planning early in the process. And what we discovered was that the site engineers had it in their mind that they could do all of the work hot. And we actually identified some things that they hadn't thought about, and there was no way to do them hot. They were going to have to do a cold cutover of those things. So it actually shifted the entire turnaround schedule for the plant. So thinking about some of those things early on and getting as much detail as you can early on typically helps to address some of these risk areas. So we're going to talk just a little bit more about risk mitigation. It's a complex topic, and I'm only covering it in fairly general terms. But first, when you encounter high-risk areas, spend that additional time and effort on the engineering design, as I just mentioned. And you know, one example is if the accuracy of an existing junction box termination drawing is a concern to you, then maybe you actually have a designer field verify point by point during the FEL. This will require more investment up front, but it lowers the risk in the project later on if the drawings are actually wrong. Now, maybe this isn't an option. Maybe you've got a set FEL budget. The client says, no, I'm not going to include that detailed design at this stage. Then how do you handle the risk and how do you mitigate it? Well, you can add contingency into your estimate or budget or a line item going into the next phase or into the project itself that really covers this work. So rather than actually doing the field verification of the junction box terminations during the FEL, you have that set up as part of the follow-on project or the next phase of the FEL. So that's another option, is using estimate and budget contingencies. In some cases, detailed mitigation plans are required. You know, if you've got an issue that is really troublesome and you know it could have a huge impact on the project, sometimes you just need to spend the time and put together a full plan around a mitigation plan around that particular activity. So as I said, this is just a high-level summary conversation of risk. But last month, Jeff Miller of Interstate's Control Systems gave a great and much more detailed presentation on managing project risk. And for any of you that weren't able to attend, I would point you to that presentation on the CSIA website because it's an excellent resource for you to use. So now we're getting to my pet peeve, which is project management requirements. And This is important because it captures the needs and aligns the expectations regarding the project management effort at the beginning of the project. And general requirements that should be established include the frequency and location of project management meetings, particularly if you're a remote system integrator from the site that you're working at. You know, are phone meetings okay? Are video conferences required? Do you need to be at site? Do they come to your site? All of those things impact your cost moving into the project. So you really want to try to define those things up front during the FEL. The desired frequency and format of project management reports, and we've got some good examples of this in a moment. And then the change order management process is another key area that you want to try to nail down at the beginning of the project. These are just a few examples of some of the project management considerations. But in the FEL scope, schedule, and budget, you really want to create and establish clear project management responsibilities and the definition of the work to be done. It is a vital part of the work scope, and it should be detailed out just like any other technical area. And you know, it doesn't always happen. So don't neglect project management when you're doing FELs because there's benefit in it to you. So looking at that in a little more detail, as an example, consider project management reporting. The key considerations of project reporting are the frequency, how often you report, the content, what's in the report, the format, how the information is presented, and the distribution, who should receive the report and how is it delivered to them. All of these things are needed to establish the amount of project management effort required in the project. I know that many system integrators just use a blanket 10 or 15% of project costs for project management budgets. And there's nothing wrong with this approach, but it's still important to ensure that everyone has the same expectation of what's going to be provided for that 10 or 15%. So don't shortchange project management definition in your FEL. You want to try to define clearly what's going to be done as part of your project management activities. So here's a very basic project management report, and it's a text-based report, and it doesn't provide supporting numbers for some of the conclusions. For example, I have listed here overall earned versus spent percentage is 67%, and progress percentage this period is 8%. But I'm not providing any backup data for those numbers. Also in the report are milestones completed since the last reporting period, what key project activities are in progress, what milestones are planned before the next reporting period, what action items or issues need to be resolved, etc. This is a very basic report, but it often suffices because it's a good way of just keeping everyone informed of the progress of the project and any issues that have arisen and that type of thing. But the question really you should be asking and answering during the FEL phase is this enough? Does your client have the expectation that you're going to present something a little more detailed? For example, extensive and complex financial reports that cover targets and include earned versus spent calculations and earned values and so forth. And the time to an investment required to complete this type of report may be very different from the time and investment required to complete the previous report that I just showed. So, you know, looking at templates and including templates in the FEL to make sure that the client's good with you know, how the project management reporting is going to be done is another thing that you want to try to establish during the FEL phase. One final item we're going to look at regarding project management requirements is change order management workflow. So different organizations handle change orders very differently. And so establishing a flow chart or a workflow can be a really beneficial thing to you because it's going to tell you what to expect if changes do occur and how long that process can take, as well as how much it might cost you as a system integrator in terms of additional project management time. So, you know, you want to try to capture as much of this as you can. Now, once you've established your scope, schedule, and budget within the FEL and then moved on to the follow-on project, project monitoring becomes the primary activity of the project manager. And project monitoring involves comparing your scope and your quality against plan, your schedule and staff against plan, your budget against plan, and then evaluating, tracking, and reporting overall project progress and making any necessary adjustments. And what should really stand out to you in looking at this project monitoring process is that it involves comparing to plan and making adjustments. And the FEL schedule, scope, budget, and risk analysis documents are your plan. They are the basis for the project, and if organized consistently and with the right level of detail, they establish your work breakdown structure for the project. So, you know, as you're moving from the FEL phase into the project monitoring and actually the project and the project monitoring aspects of project management, you really want to focus on creating a good plan at that FEL phase that will allow you to make a smooth transition. So one of the final items that I want to talk about is what if someone else does the FEL? We've talked a lot about you doing the FEL. The reality is that maybe you're bidding on a project where one of your competitors did an FEL. So how do you use what's been created to your benefit? So I would say that the first thing is when you see gaps in some of the things we've talked about today, when you get an RFP and you look at the associated FEL documents that might have been provided, and particularly when those gaps impact your ability to establish your scope, schedule, and estimate, then ask relevant questions to flesh out the details. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard system integrators tell me that they're not going to ask questions because they're concerned about giving something away to their competitors. Maybe that they're giving some insight into their strategy, or they're sharing information that the competitor hadn't thought of. You know, they do a field walk down and they have questions, but they don't ask them. And you know, I understand those concerns, but my opinion is that in most cases, if you don't ask the questions, you're only going to hurt your chances. And so I would implore you to seek and get the details you need. And by pointing out some of the things that have left out, as long as you do it in the proper manner, you're actually building credibility with the client. If you're asking questions that weren't considered as part of the FEL, then the client may go, you know, the engineering company that I hired to do this work didn't think about that, but these guys did. So, you know, keep in mind that you can actually build your credibility by asking those questions as long as you do it in the right way. Second, use assumptions and clarifications in your proposals to define it to the degree that it enables you to show your expertise and feel comfortable with your bid. So, for example, if you don't see the project management responsibilities that we just talked about adequately defined, then state your assumption. Say, since it was not specifically identified in the RFP, we have assumed monthly reporting with our attached basic project management report, and you include that template. And then what you've done is you politely pointed out the gap in the FEL documents of the RFP, and you've also protected yourself financially by setting or establishing the terms of your bid. So finally, look at the documents and see if you can use them as the basis for your project management activities. You know, if there's FEL documents included, maybe they're not organized the way you'd organize them. Consider whether you can adjust how you're going to organize things to actually leverage those documents, or if you can't, they've organized it in a way that's not going to work for you, then look at what you can use or how you can shift things around to minimize your work moving into the project. And this could save you some dollars and lower your bid a little bit. So really the proposal phase can be a time where you can actually look at and assess whether you can benefit from the FEL documents done by someone else. So in quick summary, if you're executing an FEL, take a planned and organized approach to the documents so that they can naturally transition to tools for the project management task. As you develop your scope, your schedule, and your budget, make sure they're consistent. That's key. And you also want them at the right granularity to build the work breakdown structure needed for your project management activities. And finally, use the FEL to identify the risk areas not only for your client but for yourself, and take actions to mitigate those risks, whether through design and engineering activities or through contingency in your estimate. So, you want to consider all of those things. So I really do appreciate your time today. Many of the concepts we've discussed are included in my book. While the book's title calls out control system migrations, many of the principles in the book are applicable to almost any automation projects. And as I mentioned earlier, my publisher is offering a 15% discount to CSIA members for hard copy books ordered through their website, www.momentumpress.net, through the end of September. So if you're interested, you can search for the book on their website using my last name, and then as you go through and purchase the book, you'll be asked for a discount code and use ROE92014. So anyway, I do appreciate your time again. You can contact me at info@danrconsulting.com with any questions or with anything that you'd like to discuss, and I'll be happy to take any questions at this time.
Well, if there are any questions amongst our attendees, which is a very good number today, and everyone has really stayed with the program, with the webinar here today, we appreciate that. But there haven't been any questions. Either you've overwhelmed them or you've just done a superb job of explaining FEL. So let me just do a little bit of a closing here, if all of you would stay on the line for just another minute or two. And if a question comes to mind while I'm doing this, please type it into your Q&A box. First of all, to all the attendees, I want to thank you for your participation, and my hope is that you have several takeaways that take you a bit closer to being an expert at project management, and most specifically for today, the FEL phase, that which occurs in the early stages. And Dan, thank you very much for your contribution of time and expertise. Your presentation was really very good, very insightful, and we wish the best for you. Thanks again to our host and sponsor, John Weber and Monica Anderson with Software Toolbox. And be sure to complete the survey for today's webinar. It will arrive in your inbox very soon, within the hour, and takes only like 30 seconds to complete. And we'd really love to have your feedback. It helps us to know what we could be doing better or different. And so in closing, here's a brief list of two important considerations. First of all, the exchange. If you recall, I think most of you know about the new Industrial Automation Exchange, the website CSIA developed and launched just a few months ago. Be sure your company is on it. It's an amazing tool for end users to find integrators and find products and find technical answers. And everyone, all of our members inherently were given a bronze profile to start for this first year, but I encourage you to consider the gold profile. It's the best value, gives you the best marketing tools on the site, and also there are packages available that combine a lot of things for a reduced price. Secondly, I'm currently planning the content for the 2015 CSIA Executive Conference, and I would love for you to send me your ideas if you would have any on presenters, on topics, on format, anything at all. I'm open to new ideas to improve our conference. And my email address can be found on the CSIA website. So I encourage you to do that. And finally, if you have any suggested topics for a webinar that we would do in the future, please include that in your survey comments. Okay, we did have one question come in. Dan, does your book go into more detail about project management work for RFP projects? The company I work for does a majority of this kind of work.
Yes, so I have talked a little bit about it. I haven't talked about it specifically from the system integrator perspective. My book's really taken an approach of looking at things from an end-user perspective at the early stages of the project. So, for example, how does an end user select a vendor to do their FEL? What are some of the key considerations that they should be thinking about in going through that process of selecting the right engineering company to do their work, that type of thing. So I talked extensively about key aspects of FEL, so there's a chapter or two that really touch on this kind of thing, but not necessarily from the system integrator perspective.
Okay, if there are any other questions, we'd ask that you type them into the box at this point.
I don't have any questions coming in so far.
Okay. Very good. Well, we'll assume that there are no more then. And again, thank you very much, Dan. We appreciate it, and we appreciate all of our participants for being with us today and taking advantage of this benefit of membership of CSIA. So with that, thank you again, Monica, and thanks again to all of our attendees and to Dan, and also to Dan. So that's it. Take care, everyone. Goodbye now.